Jack Thompson always thought he was a master of control, but the house he moved into quickly proved otherwise. The moment he stepped inside, it felt like the walls themselves had a plan, one that didn't include him. He thought the small, creaky house in the middle of nowhere would be the perfect escape, the fresh start he so desperately needed. But what it really was a trap. His savings drained faster than he could track, repairs piling up, and every day, the place seemed to suck the life out of him. The wallpaper peeled away like the layers of his sanity, and every creak of the floorboards whispered, "You're stuck here." This house wasn't just old, it was broken, inside and out. Jack had underestimated what it would cost him, both financially and mentally. His phone barely rang anymore, and when it did, it was just another creditor demanding payment. His once hopeful dream of a fresh start was now buried under piles of bills, unpaid rent, and mounting stress. It was as if the house was alive, its old bones pressing in on him, suffocating him slowly. He had no job to go to, no friends to call, just the isolation of a house that seemed determined to drain him dry. Maybe I should just leave, he thought, but even that felt impossible. The moment he opened his front door, the house seemed to close in behind him, pushing him back. So he stayed, day after day, waking up with the same thoughts. How am I going to make it through today? But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the feeling that everything he did was only making things worse. His savings were nearly gone, and he didn't know how to stop the bleeding. It wasn't just the house draining his money. It was everything about his life that had slipped through his fingers. The pressure of it all became overwhelming. That's when he noticed something strange. The house had a series of rooms, hidden ones. Rooms that were locked and never mentioned. And he couldn't help but wonder, what was behind those doors? The thought of finding some escape, even if just for a moment, consumed him. It wasn't long before Jack started to feel that he was living in a never-ending cycle of trying to fix what was already broken. The air in the house felt thick with regret, and Jack had no choice but to push through it. The days turned into weeks, and the money was gone. One evening, when Jack sat in the middle of his cluttered kitchen, staring at a pile of overdue bills, he heard a soft knock at the door. At first, he thought it was just the wind, the house creaking again. But the knock came again, this time louder. Jack hesitated, his hand shaking as he reached for the handle. He was expecting no one. When he opened the door, standing on the porch was the last person he ever expected to see. Ethan Clark, the janitor of the house. Jack had seen him a few times before, the quiet man who spent his days cleaning the place up, maintaining the small things. But today, something felt different about him. Ethan wasn't here to just clean. He had a look in his eyes that said he knew more than he was letting on. "You're still here?" Ethan asked, his voice gruff, but not unkind. "Yeah," Jack replied, barely able to hide the exhaustion in his voice. "I'm still here." Ethan nodded, stepping closer. "You know, there are things about this house you don't know. Things that could help you." Jack looked at him skeptically. What could this janitor possibly know about how to fix his life? But Ethan continued, "I've been working here a long time. I know the ins and outs of this place. There's more to this house than meets the eye." Jack's curiosity piqued despite himself. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Ethan smiled faintly, the kind of smile that made Jack feel both intrigued and uneasy. "There are locked doors in this house. Rooms that people don't talk about. I've seen them. Hidden rooms. Rooms that could change everything for you." The idea of secret rooms, hidden spaces within the house, was enough to stir something inside Jack. Could there be a way out of this nightmare? Maybe Ethan was offering more than just a way to fix a leaky faucet or repair a broken window. "What do you mean by hidden rooms?" Jack asked, his mind racing. Ethan's eyes gleamed with a mixture of caution and understanding. "You'll see for yourself soon enough. But first, you need to stop running from the things you can't fix. If you don't, this house will break you." Jack stood there, frozen. The possibility of finding something that could actually help him seemed too good to be true. But at this point, he didn't have much to lose. So, with a deep breath, Jack nodded. "Okay, show me." And with that, the first of many doors was about to open, and Jack was about to find out just how much his life could change. The next morning, Jack found himself standing in the kitchen, staring at the floor, unsure of what to do next. The conversation with Ethan the night before lingered in his mind, but it was hard to believe. Hidden rooms? Secret spaces in a house he had already been living in for months? It sounded absurd, Yet there was a part of him that couldn't shake the thought. He had nothing to lose. What was the worst that could happen? Another failed repair, or more bills piling up? He was already drowning. Ethan had given him a sliver of hope, and that was more than he had had in a long time. Jack walked over to the front door and hesitated, his hand resting on the doorknob. The house seemed to groan under the weight of its own age, a sound Jack had come to know all too well. But this time, it felt different. It felt like something was waiting, something he couldn't see. As he stepped outside, he saw Ethan standing near the old shed in the backyard, his back to him. Jack took a deep breath and walked toward him, his steps slow and deliberate. "You ready?" Ethan's voice broke the silence before Jack could even speak. Jack nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. Ethan turned and started walking toward the back of the house, toward the area Jack had never dared to explore before. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the fence was falling apart. It looked like the kind of place people forgot about, a forgotten corner of the world. But to Jack, it now seemed like the gateway to something bigger, something that could change everything. "This way," Ethan said, pointing to a narrow door hidden behind a thick wall of ivy. Jack couldn't see it from where he stood, but now that Ethan had pointed it out, he could just make out the outline of a small wooden door. It was barely visible, as if the house was trying to keep it a secret. "I've cleaned this place for years," Ethan continued, his voice low and steady. "I've seen this door 100 times, but it's never been opened. No one knows what's behind it." Jack's curiosity burned inside him, and without another word, he followed Ethan to the door. Ethan reached out and grabbed the handle, his fingers wrapping around it as if it had been waiting for him all along. "Are you sure about this?" Jack asked, his voice shaky. "Once you open it, there's no going back." Ethan looked at him and nodded. "I know, but sometimes you have to face what's hidden if you want to get out." The door creaked open slowly, the sound echoing in the stillness of the yard. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer, watching the door swing wide to reveal what lay beyond. What Jack saw was not what he expected. It wasn't another dark, musty room like the rest of the house. It was different. The air smelled fresher here, and the light was brighter. The room was vast, filled with old furniture and strange relics that Jack couldn't place. But the most surprising thing was the feeling of space, the feeling that this room, hidden behind the ivy-covered door, was not bound by the same rules as the rest of the house. It felt alive. Ethan stepped inside first, his movements cautious but purposeful. Jack hesitated for a moment before following him in. The room was dimly lit by a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, but there was something almost magical about the way the light flickered, casting shadows on the walls. The space was cluttered, but it wasn't the usual kind of clutter that made a place feel suffocating. No, this was different. This was the kind of mess that held stories that were waiting to be discovered. "This is where it all started," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The house wasn't always like this. It wasn't always falling apart." Jack looked around, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The room was filled with old photographs, papers, and artifacts that seemed to belong to a time long past. Some of the pictures were of people Jack didn't recognize, but others were familiar. There were pictures of the house, the same house Jack had been living in, but the photos were from a different era. The house looked different back then, newer, more vibrant. There was a sense of life, a sense of possibility that Jack had never experienced in his own time here. But there was something else in the room, something that caught his eye. At the far end of the room, behind a dusty old bookshelf, was a small chest. It was old, the wood warped with age, but it looked important, like it had been placed there for a reason. Jack felt drawn to it, as if it was calling him. He slowly walked over to the chest, his heart racing with anticipation. "What's in it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's eyes flickered toward the chest before he turned back to Jack. That's what you need to know." Jack reached for the chest, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the worn wood. The moment he touched it, a strange sensation washed over him, like he had just crossed a threshold into something he wasn't prepared for. The chest was heavy, but Jack managed to lift the lid. Inside, there was a collection of old papers, yellowed with age. As he sifted through the papers, Jack found something that stopped him cold. It was a letter, written in a handwriting he didn't recognize. The letter was dated decades ago, but it was clear that it had been meant for someone else. someone who had lived in the house before him. Jack's pulse quickened as he read the letter, the words slowly sinking in. It was a message of hope, a message about escaping the same traps Jack had fallen into. It was a map of the house, with markings that suggested hidden passages, secret rooms, and things that had been deliberately kept out of sight. Jack looked up at Ethan, his mind reeling. This is it. This is what I needed. Ethan smiled faintly. It's been here all along. You just had to open the door. Jack stood there, the letter in his hand, realizing that the key to his escape wasn't just about fixing the house. It was about understanding what had been hidden in plain sight all along. Jack held the letter in his hands, the ink slowly smudging against his trembling fingers. The map, the strange markings, it all seemed surreal. Yet, there it was, tangible and real, staring him in the face. He couldn't believe it. How had he not noticed this before? How had he been living in the same house for months without seeing the clues that had always been right in front of him? The house seemed to hold so many secrets, layers upon layers of things buried beneath the surface. The letter, the map, everything felt like it had been waiting for him to unlock it, to piece it all together. Ethan was still standing by the door, his arms crossed, waiting for Jack's reaction. Jack slowly looked up at him. So what does this mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan gave a small shrug, his eyes flickering with something Jack couldn't quite place. It means you're not alone in this. You're not the first to be trapped here, and you won't be the last. But you can change it. You can find a way out. Jack stared at the map again, his mind racing. The markings seemed to lead to places he hadn't noticed before. Hidden doors, secret staircases, places that were supposed to be impossible to find. There was a faint glow around the markings, as if they were almost alive, guiding him. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to unfold. What happens if I follow it? Jack asked. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to a nearby window, his back to Jack as he gazed outside. The light from the setting sun cast a warm glow across the yard, but the stillness felt eerie, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Finally, Ethan turned around, his gaze meeting Jack's. You'll see. You'll see what's really behind this house. What's been hidden all this time. Jack nodded, folding the map carefully and slipping it into his pocket. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the feeling in his gut told him that whatever came next would change everything. The two men walked out of the hidden room, the door creaking shut behind them. The air felt heavier now, as if the house was watching them, knowing that the game was about to change. They made their way through the cluttered yard, toward the back of the house. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding hanging over him, but at the same time, there was an excitement that pushed him forward. They reached the corner of the house, where an old shed stood, its door slightly ajar. Jack's heart raced as he glanced at Ethan, who simply nodded and motioned for him to go inside. This is where the next part of the map leads, Ethan said softly. Jack didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, the musty smell of old wood and dust hitting him immediately. The shed was small, cluttered with forgotten tools and broken furniture, but there was something about the way the shadows played across the walls that made it feel different. He stepped further into the darkness, his footfalls muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw a large, wooden crate against the far wall. It wasn't anything special at first glance, just an old box, but Jack felt an inexplicable pull toward it. Without thinking, he walked over to it, kneeling down in front of the crate. The wood was rough beneath his fingertips, the surface worn and weathered by time. He reached for the lid, his hands shaking with anticipation. What is this? Jack asked, his voice low. Ethan stood behind him, silent for a moment before answering. That's the next step, he said simply. Jack lifted the lid, the old hinges creaking as it opened. Inside, there was a pile of old papers, much like the ones he had found in the hidden room. But as he sifted through them, his fingers brushed against something that felt different. He pulled it out slowly, the object wrapped in a faded cloth. Unwrapping it carefully, he found a small, ornate key, its metal shining in the dim light. What's this for? Jack asked, holding it up. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the key. That's the key to the last room. The room no one talks about. The room that no one has dared to open for years. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. The last room? What could possibly be behind a door that had been sealed for so long? His curiosity grew stronger by the second, and before he could stop himself, he turned and ran out of the shed, heading straight for the back door of the house. Ethan followed closely behind, not saying a word. Jack reached the door, the key cold in his hand, and inserted it into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway he had never seen before. The air was thick with dust, and the light barely filtered in through the cracked windows. Jack stepped inside, his heart racing as he looked around. The hallway seemed endless, stretching out in front of him like a dark tunnel. The walls were lined with old portraits, their faces blurred and faded with age. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as if this part of the house had been forgotten for centuries. As Jack walked further down the hallway, he began to notice strange symbols etched into the walls, similar to the markings on the map. They seemed to glow faintly, guiding him forward. The farther he went, the more he felt like he was crossing some kind of threshold, entering a world that was completely separate from the rest of the house. The hallway ended at a door, ancient and weathered, but still intact. Jack's hand shook as he reached for the handle. "This is it," Ethan said quietly from behind him. "Everything you've been looking for, everything you've been missing, is behind this door." Jack took a deep breath and turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a room unlike anything he had ever seen. The room was vast, its walls lined with shelves filled with old books and strange artifacts. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust. But the most striking thing about the room was the center, where a large, ornate table stood. On it, there were several objects, books, papers, strange trinkets, each one more mysterious than the last. Jack walked slowly toward the table, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Jack stood frozen in the doorway of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. The sight before him was unlike anything he had ever imagined. The room was vast, with shelves upon shelves filled with ancient books, scrolls, and strange artifacts. There was an eerie quietness to the space, as if time had stopped here. The air was thick with dust, the smell of old leather and paper filling his senses. But what struck him most was the table in the center of the room. It was large, made of dark, polished wood, and covered in objects that seemed out of place. There were books, papers, strange trinkets. Some of them Jack couldn't even begin to identify. The room felt heavy with the weight of its secrets. Jack stepped inside, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. The floor creaked under his weight as he moved closer to the table. His hands trembled as he reached out and touched the surface. The wood was cold, smooth under his fingertips, but it felt important. Each item on the table seemed to have a story, each one a piece of a puzzle that Jack wasn't sure he was ready to solve. But the curiosity that had been building in him for so long pushed him forward. He picked up one of the books, its cover worn and faded. As he opened it, the pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams. It looked like a journal of some kind, but the writing was indecipherable. He flipped through the pages quickly, searching for something that would make sense of what he was looking at. But nothing made sense. The more he flipped through, the more confused he became. This wasn't just a journal. It was a record of something far older, far deeper than he had ever expected. Jack set the book down and reached for a small box sitting beside it. The box was intricately carved, with delicate patterns etched into the wood. He opened it, and inside was a collection of small, shining stones. Each one was different, but they all seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as he stared at them. What were they, and why were they here? As he examined the stones, a sense of unease crept over him. Something about this room, about all of these objects, felt wrong. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew that it was something far beyond his understanding. He couldn't help but feel like he had just stumbled upon something that wasn't meant to be discovered. But there was no turning back now. He had come this far. He couldn't just leave without knowing the truth. He turned to Ethan, who had been standing quietly by the door, watching him. "What is all this?" Jack asked, his voice shaky. Ethan looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he slowly walked over to the table and picked up one of the books. "This," he said, his voice low, "is the history of the house. It's everything that's been hidden from you." Jack's mind raced as he tried to process what Ethan was saying. Hidden? How could this be hidden? He had been living in this house for months, And yet this entire room, this whole world, had been right under his nose the entire time. But why? Why keep all of this secret? Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't answer right away. He simply continued to examine the books and the objects on the table, as if searching for something. Jack waited, the silence growing heavy between them. Finally, Ethan spoke. Because the house, it's not just a house. It's a place of power. A place that has been used for centuries by people who wanted to control the world around them. Jack stared at Ethan, trying to make sense of his words. A place of power? Control the world? This was getting too strange. Too much to comprehend. But Ethan wasn't finished. He walked over to a large chest that sat against the far wall of the room and opened it. Inside was a collection of old papers, some yellowed with age, others more recent. These papers, Ethan said, contain the true history of this house. It was built by people who understood things that most can't even imagine. They knew how to tap into the energy of this place, how to manipulate it. Jack's mind spun. Energy? Manipulate? What was Ethan talking about? He walked over to the chest, his curiosity outweighing his fear. He peered over Ethan's shoulder at the papers. Some of them were written in languages Jack didn't recognize. Others were filled with diagrams that looked almost like blueprints. There were drawings of the house, but they were different from the house Jack knew. They showed rooms, passages, and spaces that didn't exist in the version of the house he had been living in. What is this? Jack asked, his voice barely audible. Ethan glanced at him, his face serious. This is the map of the house's true layout. The one that no one has been allowed to see for generations. There are doors, secret doors, passageways, places that were hidden from everyone. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. What are you saying? Are you saying this house is alive? Ethan paused, his expression grim. Not alive exactly, but it has a power. And those who understand it, those who can unlock its secrets, have the ability to control the energy within it. Jack's mind raced as he tried to process what Ethan was telling him. Was this what had been happening all along? Was this the reason he had felt so trapped? The reason the house had seemed to drain him dry? Ethan seemed to sense Jack's confusion. It's not just you. It's everyone who's ever lived here. The house feeds off its occupants. It draws from them, takes from them. And the more you try to escape, the tighter its grip becomes. Jack felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. This was insane. It had to be. But as he looked around the room, at the strange artifacts and the maps, a part of him couldn't deny that what Ethan was saying made sense. The house had always felt wrong, like something was lurking beneath the surface, something that Jack couldn't understand. But now, standing in this room, surrounded by the evidence, it all seemed to come together. Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. So what do we do now, he asked. Ethan's eyes locked onto his. Now, we do what no one has been able to do for years. We break the house's hold. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jack didn't know if he was ready for what that would entail. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep living this way. Something had to change. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Ethan's words hanging in the air. Jack's mind raced, trying to process everything he had just learned. The house wasn't just a house. It was a force, something far beyond his understanding. It had been draining him, trapping him, feeding off his energy. And now Ethan was saying they could break its hold. Jack had to admit, a part of him was terrified. What did that even mean? What did it take to break a house's hold on someone? But there was another part of him, a part that had been buried beneath all the stress and despair, that wanted to believe. He had been suffocating for so long, trapped in a cycle of endless bills and repairs, feeling like he was losing his grip on reality. This was his chance to take control back, to escape. He couldn't let fear stop him now. So how do we do it? Jack asked, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in his mind. Ethan met his gaze, his eyes calm and sure. We use the map. We follow the paths, the markings, the hidden doors. Each one leads to something important. Something that, when unlocked, weakens the house's grip. Jack nodded, feeling a surge of determination. He didn't know what exactly they would find behind each door, but he couldn't let the house win. Not when he was this close to breaking free. What do we need to do first? Jack asked, stepping closer to the table where the map lay. Ethan picked up a small piece of chalk from the table and handed it to Jack. We start by marking the first door. The one closest to here. That's the one we need to open first. Jack took the chalk, his hands still trembling slightly, but he felt a strange calm wash over him as he looked at the map. The markings seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, waiting for him to make his move. He marked the first door, the one closest to them, and then stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. But Jack felt it. The air in the room shifted, growing heavier. The house seemed to respond, as if it were aware that something was changing. "We need to move quickly," Ethan said, his voice urgent. "The longer we stay here, the stronger the house's hold will become." Jack's heart raced, but he pushed the fear aside. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. He followed Ethan as they made their way through the house, each step taking them closer to the first door. As they walked down the familiar hallways, Jack couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. The house, which had once felt like a prison, now seemed almost alive, like it was watching them, waiting to see what they would do. They reached the first door, an old wooden door tucked away in the corner of the hallway. Jack felt a sense of unease as he looked at it, but he knew this was it. This was the moment. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward, placing his hand on the doorknob. Jack watched as Ethan hesitated for just a moment before turning the knob and pushing the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the hallway. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he stepped inside. The room beyond was unlike any other Jack had seen in the house. It was large, but there was a sense of stillness, as if no one had been in this room for years. The walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper, and the air was thick with dust. But what caught Jack's attention was the center of the room. There, in the middle, stood an old pedestal, and on top of it, a small crystal. The crystal shimmered in the dim light, its surface smooth and glowing faintly. Jack took a step closer, feeling an undeniable pull toward it. He reached out and touched the crystal, and the moment his fingers brushed against it, a shock of energy shot through him. It wasn't painful, but it was powerful, like a wave of electricity rushing through his body. He jerked his hand back, surprised by the intensity of the feeling. "What was that?" Jack asked, his voice shaky. Ethan stepped into the room, his expression serious. "That crystal is part of the house's core," he said. "It's what powers everything. It's what keeps the house alive." Jack stared at the crystal, realizing that this was the key. This was the source of everything. The house's hold over him, over everyone who had ever lived there. And now, it was within his reach. "So we destroy it?" Jack asked, his heart pounding in his chest. Ethan shook his head. "No, we don't destroy it. We simply disconnect it. We cut the power. That's how we break the house's hold." Jack nodded, understanding now. He couldn't destroy it, but he could take away its power. He could break free. Ethan handed Jack a small knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light. "You have to sever the connection. Just below the crystal, there's a wire. You need to cut it." Jack took the knife, his hand steady now. He had come too far to back out. He walked toward the pedestal, his steps slow but determined. As he reached the crystal, he could feel the energy humming in the air, almost like it was trying to stop him. But Jack didn't hesitate. He raised the knife and carefully cut the wire. The moment the wire snapped, the crystal pulsed, its glow fading as the energy around them shifted. Jack felt a sudden wave of relief wash over him, as if the house had let go of its grip. The air seemed lighter, the weight that had been pressing down on him for so long lifting just a little. Ethan smiled, the first real smile Jack had seen from him. "That's the first step," he said quietly. "We've broken the first connection." Jack stood there for a moment, taking in the silence. The house was still standing, but something had changed. The power was no longer flowing the way it had before. And for the first time in a long while, Jack felt hope. They weren't done yet, but this was a victory. A small one, but a victory nonetheless. The air in the room felt different now. It was lighter, as if a weight had been lifted, but the change was subtle. Jack stood motionless, staring at the pedestal where the crystal had once been. He could still feel the echo of its energy, but now, it seemed to be dissipating, like smoke vanishing into the air. The house no longer seemed to press in on him as it had before, but there was still a sense that it was watching, waiting. Jack's heart still raced, but now it was from anticipation. For the first time since he had moved in, he felt a sense of control, a glimmer of hope. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes flicking between Jack and the now emptied pedestal. "That's the first step," he said again, his voice steady but with an edge of excitement. But don't get too comfortable. There's still more to do. Jack nodded, taking a deep breath. What's next? Ethan's gaze became more intense, his expression serious. Next, we need to make our way to the center of the house. That's where the core of its power is hidden. It's been buried deep beneath the foundation, and it's been feeding the house for decades. Jack swallowed, the realization hitting him hard. They weren't done yet. They had just taken the first step, but the true battle was still ahead of them. How do we get there? He asked. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to the far side of the room, where the wall was lined with strange symbols and drawings that Jack hadn't noticed before. He walked over to them and traced one of the markings with his finger, the movement slow and deliberate. Jack moved to stand beside him, his curiosity piqued. What is this? Jack asked, looking at the intricate designs. Ethan looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. This is the map. The full map. Jack's brow furrowed. I thought the map we've been using was the full map. Ethan shook his head. No, that was just a guide, a starting point. The full map is much older, and it shows the true path, the way to the heart of the house. Jack felt a cold shiver run down his spine. And how do we use it? Ethan didn't reply immediately. Instead, he reached out and placed his hand on one of the symbols. The moment his skin touched it, a soft light began to glow around the edges of the wall, illuminating the entire room. Jack stepped back in surprise, his eyes wide. What is this? This, Ethan said, his voice low and serious, is the final key. It unlocks the last door, the one that leads to the heart. Jack's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment that would either set him free or trap him here forever. He had no choice but to follow through. Let's do it, Jack said, his voice firm, even though doubt still gnawed at him. Ethan nodded, his expression grim. This won't be easy. Once we open that door, there's no going back. Jack didn't hesitate. He couldn't. The house had already taken too much from him, and he couldn't afford to lose any more. Together, they turned toward the far end of the room, where another door stood. This one was larger than the others, its frame heavy with age. Ethan stepped forward, and Jack followed, each step bringing them closer to the heart of the house. When they reached the door, Ethan turned to Jack. This is it, he said quietly. Once we open this door, we'll be at the center. But we need to be ready. The house won't give up without a fight. Jack took a deep breath and nodded. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not really. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. Ethan reached for the doorknob, his hand shaking ever so slightly. Jack's heart hammered in his chest as Ethan slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside, at the center of the room, stood a massive stone pillar. It was smooth and dark, covered in markings that Jack recognized from the map. The energy in the room was palpable, thick and heavy, swirling around them. Jack stepped forward, his body tensing as he moved closer to the pillar. The markings on the stone seemed to pulse with a strange rhythm, as if they were alive. Ethan followed closely behind him, his eyes fixed on the pillar. This is it, Ethan said again, his voice barely above a whisper. The source of the house's power. Jack stared at the pillar, his breath shallow. What do we do? Ethan's eyes met his, and for the first time, Jack saw a flicker of uncertainty in them. We need to sever the connection. The pillar is connected to everything. The walls, the rooms, the very foundation of the house. If we cut the link, the house will lose its power. Jack nodded, his mind already racing through the steps. He couldn't stop now. They had come too far. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, curved knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light. You need to make the incision, he said, handing the knife to Jack. It has to be precise. One wrong move, and it could trigger something we can't control. Jack took the knife, his fingers tight around the handle. The moment he held it, a strange surge of energy coursed through him, as if the knife itself was connected to the pillar. He walked slowly toward the stone, his hand steady as he approached the center of the markings. The air grew colder the closer he got, and he could feel the pulse of the house beneath his feet, as if it were trying to pull him in. Jack took a deep breath and raised the knife. He brought the blade down, cutting into the stone with all the strength he had. The moment the knife made contact, a deafening sound filled the room, as if the entire house had let out a breath it had been holding for centuries. Jack stepped back, his heart racing. The room trembled, the walls shaking as the energy around them shifted. The house was reacting. They had done it. They had severed the connection. The energy around them began to dissipate, slowly at first, then faster, until it felt like the house was exhaling a final sigh. Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him, and for the first time since he had moved in, he felt like he was free. The house no longer had a hold on him. It was done. He had won. But even as the house seemed to settle, Jack knew the fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done. They had broken the power, but the house was not going to go down without a final attempt to regain control. Jack looked at Ethan, his chest still heaving from the effort. "What now?" he asked. Ethan's eyes were steady. "Now, we make sure it never comes back." The silence that followed the severing of the connection felt like a breath held for far too long, finally released. Jack stood still, his body trembling with exhaustion, as the energy that had once pulsed through the house now began to dissipate. The oppressive weight that had been suffocating him for so long was lifting, slowly but surely, like the house itself was exhaling, letting go of its grip. Ethan stood beside him, his gaze focused on the pillar where the markings had been, now fading, the stone no longer pulsing with unnatural energy. For a moment, the only sound in the room was their breathing, shallow and heavy from the strain of what they had just done. Jack couldn't quite believe it. They had actually done it. The power that had controlled the house, controlled him, for so long was gone. But even as relief began to wash over him, he knew that this wasn't the end. The house was no longer alive with energy, but its secrets were still there, buried beneath its walls. Ethan spoke, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "This isn't over. The house may have lost its grip, but there's still one final task." Jack turned to him, his heart pounding with the realization that there was more to be done. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Ethan's eyes locked onto his, serious and unwavering. "The house may be powerless, but its history isn't. There are still people who seek to use its power to revive it. And we can't let that happen." Jack's stomach twisted. He had thought that once the connection was severed, that would be the end of it. But now he understood. The house had been a tool for something much bigger, something more dangerous. "So what do we do?" Jack asked, his mind racing with possibilities. Ethan took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the room. "We destroy its foundation. We make sure no one can ever harness its power again. We need to remove everything that's left, every last trace." Jack swallowed, the weight of Ethan's words settling heavily on him. The foundation? The idea of destroying something so vast, so deeply embedded into the house, seemed almost impossible. But the more Jack thought about it, the more he understood. He couldn't let the house continue to influence others, to continue to drain and control. "How do we do that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked at him, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We have the map. We know where the final key lies. We just need to find it and destroy it. The foundation is what keeps everything intact. If we take it out, the house will crumble. And with it, everything it stands for." Jack nodded slowly, feeling a surge of determination. He had come this far, and he couldn't stop now. "Where is it?" he asked, his eyes searching Ethan's face for any sign of doubt. Ethan gestured toward the far corner of the room, where a small, unassuming door stood. Jack hadn't noticed it before, but now, as Ethan pointed to it, he felt a strange pull, like it had always been there, waiting for them. That door leads to the final chamber. The core. The foundation of everything. Jack's pulse quickened. This was it. The final step. The door was old, its wood darkened with age and neglect. There were no markings on it, no clues, just the simple appearance of an ordinary door. But Jack knew better. Behind that door lay the heart of the house, the very thing that kept it alive. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, his hand resting on the doorknob. It felt cool to the touch, and for a moment, Jack hesitated. But then, without another thought, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked, the sound sharp in the stillness of the room. Beyond the door was a narrow hallway, lit by a single, flickering light bulb that cast long shadows along the walls. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under Jack's weight as he stepped inside. Ethan followed closely behind, his footsteps light but purposeful. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, each step taking them deeper into the unknown. The walls were lined with more markings, more symbols, all of them familiar from the map they had followed. They were getting closer to the core, closer to the heart of the house. Jack could feel the energy shifting, the air growing heavier, as if the house itself were aware of their presence. When they reached the end of the hallway, they found another door. This one was different. It was solid metal, with intricate engravings that Jack couldn't quite make out. The air around it felt thick, almost oppressive, like it was guarding something. "This is it," Ethan said, his voice barely audible. "This is the door to the core, the foundation." Jack's hands shook as he reached for the door, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had to open it. They had to finish what they had started. He grasped the cold metal handle and turned. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a large chamber beyond. The room was empty, save for a large stone pedestal in the center. On top of it lay a small, glowing crystal. The crystal pulsed with a soft light, casting strange shadows across the walls. Jack could feel the power emanating from it, the same energy that had been present in the house all along. "Is that it?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving. "The crystal, that's the foundation. That's what holds the house together. If we destroy it, the house will collapse." Jack took a deep breath and stepped forward. The crystal seemed to call to him, its light hypnotic. But he couldn't let that stop him. He had come this far. He had to do it. With a steady hand, Jack reached out and took the crystal from the pedestal. The moment his fingers closed around it, the room trembled. The walls shook, the floor cracked beneath their feet. Jack's heart raced as he felt the energy pulsing stronger, as if the house itself was trying to fight back. "What do we do now?" Jack asked, his voice tight. "We destroy it," Ethan said, stepping closer. "We break it." Jack looked down at the crystal, his grip tightening. This was the final step. He could feel the power coursing through it, and he knew that once it was destroyed, the house's hold would be broken forever. With one final, determined motion, Jack crushed the crystal in his hands. The moment it shattered, a blinding light filled the room. The walls trembled, the floor cracked open beneath them, and Jack felt the entire house begin to collapse, as if the very foundation of everything was giving way. But Jack didn't flinch. He stood firm, knowing that this was the end. The house was finally free from its grip on him. He was free. As the light faded, Jack stood there, breathing heavily, the weight of what they had done settling in. The house around them groaned one last time before falling silent. The power was gone. The house was no longer alive. Jack and Ethan stood together, the silence between them speaking volumes. They had done it. They had broken the house's hold. And now, Jack was free to live the life he had always dreamed of. The collapse of the house was not a violent one. It didn't come crashing down in an explosive, fiery destruction, but rather it was more like a slow exhale, a final sigh of relief. The air grew still, and Jack could feel it. An undeniable, profound silence that filled the entire space. For the first time since he had stepped foot into that house, the atmosphere was calm. The oppressive weight was gone, and in its place, there was only peace. The floors, once creaking with the house's ancient energy, were quiet now. The walls, which had seemed to close in on him from every angle, now felt open and expansive. The house no longer controlled him. It was no longer feeding off him, draining his spirit, his money, his hopes. It was done. Jack took a deep breath, his chest rising with a sense of freedom he hadn't known in a long time. Ethan stood beside him, watching the final remnants of the house's influence fade away. Neither of them spoke at first. The moment needed no words. It was a moment of victory, a moment that carried the weight of everything they had been through. Jack glanced at Ethan, who was still looking around the room. The look in his eyes wasn't one of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction, as if he knew this day would come. "We did it," Jack said softly, more to himself than to Ethan. Ethan nodded, his voice low and reflective. "Yes, but it's not just about breaking free. It's about what comes next." Jack frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Ethan turned to face him, his expression serious but calm. "The house had power, yes, but it was only a small piece of a larger story. There are other places like this, other forces, other energies that people have been trying to control for centuries. What we did here was important, but it's not over." Jack felt a shiver of uncertainty run through him. He had thought that once the house was free from its grip, that would be the end of it. But Ethan was right. He had known there was something bigger at play, something beyond what he had experienced. "What do we do now?" Jack asked, his voice filled with a quiet urgency. "We can't let what happened here happen again," Ethan said. "We need to make sure the knowledge doesn't spread. We need to find those who would seek to revive it and stop them before they can do any more damage." Jack nodded, understanding the gravity of Ethan's words. They hadn't just broken free from the house. They had uncovered something far deeper, something that needed to be guarded. "But how?" Jack asked. Ethan paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he considered the question. "There are people who know about this, who understand the power that can be harnessed from places like this one. But there are also those who want to exploit it. We've seen enough destruction already. We can't let them take control of these places again." Jack thought for a moment. "So what do we do? Do we just leave?" Ethan shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "No, we keep moving forward. We find the others who are trying to control these forces, and we stop them. Together." Jack felt a surge of determination flood through him. They had already faced the unimaginable, and now, the next challenge was to protect the world from the very forces that had once trapped him. Ethan was right. They couldn't just walk away. They had come this far, and there was still work to be done. He turned and looked one last time at the house behind him. It was no longer the same. The dark presence that had once ruled over it was gone, replaced with nothing but a hollow shell. The foundation was shattered, the house no longer a prison, but a mere structure, empty and lifeless. Jack could feel the weight of the journey they had completed together, but also the weight of the journey still ahead. The world was full of hidden places, hidden powers, and now it was up to them to ensure that nothing like this could ever happen again. "Let's go," Jack said, turning back to Ethan, his voice firm and filled with resolve. Ethan nodded, and together, they walked away from the house. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Jack felt ready to face whatever came next. He had been freed from the grip of the house, but the fight wasn't over. There was a world to protect, and Jack was ready to stand guard. As they walked away, the house slowly faded behind them, leaving nothing but a memory of what had been, a shadow of a past now destroyed. Jack knew that no matter what came next, he was not alone. He had found something in himself, a strength he never knew he had, and with Ethan by his side, he was ready for the challenges that lay ahead. The fight against the forces of darkness was far from over, but Jack was no longer a victim. He was a fighter, and that made all the difference. The road ahead was uncharted. Jack and Ethan walked together, side by side, leaving behind the remnants of the house that had once controlled their lives. The journey they had just completed felt like a chapter closed, but it was also the beginning of something else. They hadn't just defeated a house. They had uncovered a power much bigger than they could have imagined. The world was full of hidden forces, places like the house they had just destroyed, places that held secrets capable of shifting the balance of everything. As they walked, the air around them seemed different, lighter. The oppressive weight that had hung over Jack for so long was finally gone. He felt a strange sense of calm, mixed with the realization that there was still so much left to do. They had cracked open a door to a world of unknowns, and it was up to them to ensure that no one would be able to harness that power again. "Where do we go from here?" Jack asked, his voice filled with a quiet sense of resolve. Ethan didn't answer right away. He was looking ahead, his gaze focused on the horizon as if he could already see the next challenge waiting for them. Finally, he turned to Jack, his expression steady, unshaken. "We keep moving forward," he said. "We search for those who would try to exploit these forces and stop them. We can't let what happened here spread." Jack nodded, understanding the weight of Ethan's words. The world was a dangerous place, and there were still those out there who sought to control the power that had nearly destroyed him. He felt the responsibility settling in on his shoulders, but it was a burden he was willing to carry. "How do we even begin to find them?" Jack asked, his mind racing with possibilities. Ethan glanced at him, a glimmer of something, knowledge, maybe even a little fear, flashing across his face. "We start by looking for signs, for places like the house we just destroyed. There are others out there, hiding in plain sight, using the same kind of power." Jack looked around, the landscape stretching out before them. The world looked so peaceful, but Jack knew better now. He couldn't just ignore the dangers lurking in the shadows. They were everywhere, just waiting for the right moment to strike. How do we know where to look? Jack asked. What if we miss something? Ethan stopped walking for a moment, turning to face him. His expression was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes. We don't miss anything. We trust the map. We trust the knowledge we've gained. The power we destroyed here is just the beginning. There's more out there, and we're going to find it. Jack stood still for a moment, absorbing Ethan's words. The weight of their task wasn't lost on him. They were no longer just two men who had stumbled upon a haunted house. They were protectors now, guardians of something much bigger. The world they had once known, the world that had seemed so ordinary, was not as it seemed. It was full of hidden places, hidden dangers, and dark forces that needed to be kept in check. I'm ready, Jack said, finally. I don't know how much more of this I can handle, but I know it's not over. And I'm not going to run from it. Ethan smiled, a rare and genuine smile, one that softened his usually serious expression. Good. Because it's not just about stopping the dark forces. It's about preventing others from even knowing they exist. Jack glanced back at the house one last time, watching as it faded from view in the distance. It was behind him now, but the journey was far from over. The house may have been destroyed, but the power it had held was still out there, still waiting for someone to unlock it again. And Jack knew that he and Ethan would be the ones to stop it. So what's the first step? Jack asked, his voice steady with the weight of their new mission. Ethan looked ahead, his expression focused. We start with the map, he said. It'll guide us to the places we need to investigate. And from there, we find the people who are trying to control these forces. Jack's mind raced as he thought about the path ahead. They didn't know exactly where the map would lead them or what they would find when they got there. But they knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stop now. There were forces in the world that no one understood, forces that, if left unchecked, could tear everything apart. And Jack and Ethan were the only ones who could stop them. Let's do this, Jack said, determination in his voice. He turned to walk alongside Ethan, feeling the weight of the journey still ahead of them, but also the fire that had been lit within him. They weren't just walking away from the past anymore. They were walking toward something much bigger. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a sense of purpose, something he hadn't felt in years. It was strange, knowing that the house was behind him. But what lay ahead was unknown, a vast expanse of potential danger and discovery. And Jack was ready to face whatever came next. Together, he and Ethan would find the answers. Together, they would keep the world safe. And together, they would stop the darkness from ever returning. Jack knew there would be challenges, but he also knew he wasn't alone. Ethan was by his side, and with that, he felt ready for whatever lay ahead.